Real estate is a field that is ever evolving, and every transaction is totally different from the next. And in my years of experience, I've learned quite a bit that I want to pass on to those that are watching and want to learn a little bit more about how to best prepare for a home sale or purchase. So today I'm going to be sharing some client stories and what I learned from them so that if you're looking to buy or sell, you have a little bit more knowledge under your belt. My name is Madison Arthur, a local real estate broker here in Seattle-Bellevue, helping buyers and sellers find the right fit. Now let's jump right in. Okay, so first we're going to be talking about a condo purchase that happened back in August. So I recently helped a buyer find a condo in Queen Anne that they really loved. But what we wanted to do was include an HOA review period with a resale certificate specialist. Now, when you're purchasing a condo, you're going to have a ton of HOA information given and provided to you through a resale certificate package. So this shows the reserve funds, the HOA finances, rules and regulations, and everything to do with the condo building's health. Because when you buy a condo, you're purchasing the building and the unit itself, so it's important to know that both are in good condition and not just the unit. As a real estate broker, our scope is minimal in understanding these HOA packages to their full extent because sometimes they're hundreds of pages long. So similar to how you would hire an inspector, I always recommend hiring an HOA specialist to review these documents for you and evaluate the level of risk in buying a particular building. Now, particularly in Seattle, we're kind of in an interesting place where there are a lot of older condo buildings and they have repairs that need to be done. Roof, siding, perhaps the HVAC system, whatever it may be, it needs to be done eventually. And we're hitting a point where there are quite a few buildings that are at that stage where a lot of their structures and systems are reaching the end of their life. Now, the way that this is typically handled is through the reserve fund of an HOA, and this is paid for by all of the owners within the building who contribute a monthly HOA fee. Now, sometimes that HOA fee is not enough to cover the maintenance of the building. So what can happen is that the building will write up a special assessment, which means you're going to have to pay more each month to pay off whatever projects need to be done. Now, sometimes these special assessments can be quite hefty, especially with these older buildings, and sometimes they're not too bad. It really just depends. But all of it is important to be aware of before purchasing a condo. At the end of the day, when my client and I were reviewing the HOA documents with the resale certificate specialist, we learned that this home was just not a good investment because the building was not in the best condition and there was a lot of work that was going to probably come up in special assessments. What this really meant was it was a risky investment for my client. So we ended up walking away from the transaction. And to me, that's just as big of a win as actually getting a client the home of their dreams, because I want to make sure that everyone has a good investment on their hands, and this wasn't it. And I'm glad that we took the time to find that out. So, first story that I have to share is hire a resale certificate specialist if you are looking at an older building in Seattle. Okay, next story. All right, so my next story is about an escalation clause, and this is something that you're gonna have to talk to your broker about. Now, basically in multi-offer scenarios, when a bunch of buyers wanna buy the same house, instead of just writing their max purchase price, they're gonna include an escalator. And what this basically does is it allows the buyer to bounce their purchase price up only against competing offers. So perhaps they're willing to buy the house for $600,000, but if someone else purchases the home for $650,000, they're willing to go all the way up to $675,000. And what ends up happening is your purchase price will slowly bounce up until you reach the point where you've hit your max against a competing party. Now, when escalation clauses are actually drafted and reviewed by the listing broker, they're not just going to look at your purchase price. They're also going to look at all other financial terms. So that means buyer broker compensation, your seller credits, if you do happen to include any, everything that pencils out your financial purchase price. So for that reason, you can sometimes save yourself some money by not signing a redrafted contract. So what happens sometimes is instead of brokers just accepting your offer and letting the escalation clause contract kick in, they're going to request that you rewrite your offer with the new purchase price that your home escalates to. However, you can be saving yourself some money if you refuse to do this because, for example, if a buyer broker fee on your side happens to be lower than the competing offer, then the net purchase price of your escalation might go down a little bit. I have saved my clients $15,000 just by not signing a new offer and rather asking the seller to accept our initial escalated offer. Recently, my client and I wrote an offer at $1,300,000 with an escalation all the way to $1,375,000. We were up against one other competing party, and so we knew that what we wanted to do was include an escalation addendum. What this meant is that we were going to bounce our purchase price up incrementally only $15,000 above that competing buyer's offer up to $1,375,000. Now, ultimately, our escalation went all the way up to $1,375,000, which was our max. However, when we were about to go under contract, aka when the seller was to accept our offer, they asked us to re-sign our entire contract with a new purchase price instead of just letting the escalated contract purchase price live as was and sign our original offer. Now, this is pretty common because it's an easier way to calculate the purchase price, and it is technically what the buyer is willing to pay. However, you can sometimes leave money on the table by doing this as a buyer. The reason why is because an escalation clause considers all criteria of a contract: the buyer broker fee, seller credits, anything financially. So it includes the net payout that the seller would make. Now, we asked that they just accept our offer as was instead of re-signing this contract because it turned out that the buyer broker fee difference allowed us to save $10,000 on the contract. And so I recommend that once you hit that phase of mutual acceptance and the seller asks you to sign the contract, depending on the situation, consider declining and allowing them to sign your contract as is because it might save you money. Now, I will say if you are in a competing situation with 5 or more offers, I would suggest signing it because you want to make sure that your net payout doesn't go so low as to now being right up against another competing party. So it is situation dependent, and if you want to learn more about how that works, comment escalation down below and I can really make a video deep diving and breaking it all down because it is something that buyers and brokers can get a little bit confused on, so understanding it is important. Now, let's go on to the last story. All right, my last story is actually more of a loss than a win, but I feel like it's really important to talk about the good and the bad. Now, one important thing I want to mention is if you are a seller, your first offer is often your best offer, and we see it time and time again. When you think about days on market, the longer you're on, the less money you're going to make. It's just how it is because buyers are going to see that they have a lot more wiggle room and negotiation room, especially when they're the only party writing an offer. So when you do get a contract come in, really consider working with it because you don't know when your next one's going to be, and you certainly don't know if it's going to be better. Now, a few months back, we listed a property that ended up getting an offer within about 30 days, and that offer was about $40,000 below the asking price, which this was a pretty expensive house, so that number made pretty good sense, and we encouraged our sellers to take it. However, they just weren't willing to budge and meet in the middle, and they wanted to wait it out and see if they could get something a little bit better. Now, a few months went by and we eventually did get an offer, and that offer ended up being just fractionally below the first one. So they ended up making less money, and they had to pay all the expenses of keeping their home on the market for 3 more months. And you really don't want to have that happen as a seller, especially right now in Seattle, where we are in a time where prices are being slashed left and right, and buyers just have a lot more negotiation. So I just want you to consider that as a seller, most of the time, not all of the time, most of the time, your first offer or your first couple offers are really the strongest ones. And of course, we will And of course, as agents, we're going to advocate on your behalf and really let you know if this is worth pursuing or not, because there are some buyers who lowball and there are some buyers who are not educated on the value of real estate. So it can happen, but most of the time, your first is your best. So those are just 3 stories that I wanted to share about my experience in real estate and different things I've learned in the business, but I'm happy to make a part 2 if you want to watch that. Thanks so much for watching. Once again, my name is Madison Arthur. I'll see you for the next one.